Hello everyone, bonjour. Mon nom est Laura Madokoro. Je suis historienne et professeure agrégée dans le département d'histoire de l'Université Carleton. And I know we're meeting virtually, but I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from my home in Ottawa, which is located on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I have to say, it's such a pleasure to be here with everyone. And I'm looking forward to the discussion with my co-presenters. It's such a distinguished panel, and it's such an honor to be part of this conversation about what it means to witness history in this current moment. By way of context, I'm a historian who works on histories of migration and race and refugees and humanitarianism. So as you can imagine, I've been thinking about history in a number of ways over the past few months. And my thoughts today are really about how the past might make us think differently about the present and how the present moment might encourage us to ask different kinds of historical questions and might encourage us to think differently about the past, both recent and distant. So the first point I want to address and think about is this question of the exceptional and the extraordinary. I think one of the challenges that historians are going to confront, if they haven't already started to do so, is the role of the great narrative, the stories that we tell about the past, and how easy it is when we are removed from historical subject to tell stories in really big ways, to make generalizations, and to offer a story, a narrative that makes sense of the past. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in the past few months is just how difficult it is to tell a single narrative about our current moment, but also about the historical past. And I've always been inclined to think about stories at the individual level, at the local level, as well as the national and the global. And one of the things that I think the pandemic is really making us think about, as well as all kinds of other events, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the US election, local events, national events, these are all things that challenge us to think about a single narrative and the role of these narratives. And so I've had a lot of fun talking with colleagues, trying to imagine what future historians are going to write about our current moment. But as we joke about that and try and understand what that's going to look like, I think we also have to ask ourselves as historians now, how can we tell narratives and stories about the past? And I think one of the challenges that historians are confronting right now is that it's impossible to tell a single story. It never was possible. And I think living through this pandemic, this extraordinary moment, is making us think about that in deeper ways. So that's one point I want to share with you, this question about the exceptional, the extraordinary, and the role of narrative. And I'll just leave that point by saying that we need to think really hard about what makes an exceptional moment or an extraordinary moment. And that's something that we have to think about when we tell stories. You can talk about the 1920s as sort of the roaring 20s, the grand times, but that wasn't true for everyone. And so whose stories do we tell? In this current moment, some people are really, really struggling and others are not. And so what narratives, what stories will be carried forward? So these are important questions that I think challenge us to think about the future and also about the past. So the second point I wanted to share with you, because it's something I've been thinking a great deal about, is the question of borders. And I say this as somebody who works on histories of migration. And one of the things that I've often said to students is that we really need to think about what we mean by migration. For the past few decades, a number of scholars have been talking about the fact that what they call the national paradigm doesn't really work when we think about migration. People move in all kinds of ways. They move from village to village, from village to city, and across international borders. That, of course, is a fairly recent phenomenon in the history of humankind, the rise of the nation state, the creation of borders. And so one of the things that I think the pandemic in particular has made us consider and maybe realize is just how arbitrary these borders are. So as I mentioned, I'm speaking to you today from my home in Ottawa, and in the spring we had the experience of the provincial border between Ottawa and Gatineau closing. So there were police checkpoints on the bridge, and what has historically been a place of high mobility, back and forth, basically two cities treated as one, all of a sudden wasn't. And for me, this was not exceptional, because I can understand how borders are reinforced at various moments in time. But for a number of my neighbors and colleagues, this was really striking and jarring because they don't think about borders all the time the way that I do. And one of the things that they sort of were working to reconcile was this idea of migration that wasn't across international borders, thinking about ourselves and our daily lives as migrants as we move between various spaces. And this to me is a really important lesson that historians can actually share in this current moment, and maybe have this message of thinking about migration differently resonate in ways that it hasn't previously. So when I tell my students, maybe think about migration, between different urban spaces or rural urban spaces, they get it on one level, but they still really like the language of immigrant and emigrant, the idea of people coming and people going and crossing international borders. And this is how we understand migration. But historically, before the rise of the nation state, people were moving, they just weren't moving across international borders. And so this is a really important lesson that I think we need to take to heart in this current moment to understand how it is that people do move, how they are prevented from moving. And obviously, in the context of the pandemic, the idea of mobile populations has been very, very troubling to public health authorities and to governments charged with keeping people safe as they think about the dangers of people moving in unfettered ways between spaces, whether it's from home to work or across international borders. So this is something that I really want to encourage people to think about, is the nature of migration historically and in our current moment, and the role that borders play in our lives, and the ways that borders are sometimes reinforced. And if I can, I'd like to tie this back to my previous point about what makes for exceptional circumstances. Because what I'm saying about borders being reinforced and difficult to transgress for some people is not necessarily new, right? For generations of refugees, for instance, who have been displaced internally or across borders, they're reckoning with the significance of borders that are reinforced is much, much more pronounced than that of people who aren't necessarily moving across these borders. And it means that their encounter with the borders in the pandemic is not necessarily exceptional or extraordinary, but it is for people who haven't had those experiences previously. So really thinking about what makes for an exceptional story, an exceptional experience in this moment is something that I think we can look at in a number of different ways. And I'll just close on this point about the borders by referencing work that a colleague did at Wilfrid Laurier University, where she's been working with Indo-Chinese refugees who came to Canada in the 1970s, and the elders in the community were quite taken aback with some of the language that was used in the spring, talking about vulnerable populations, because these were especially women who had survived life in refugee camps, who had survived displacement and persecution, and had life stories and life experiences that they brought with them for dealing with the pandemic. And that wasn't necessarily recognized in discussions of vulnerable populations. And so again, thinking about varieties of life experiences, varieties of encounters with mobility, and questions of vulnerability, I think can really help us understand more what is at stake in the current moment. So historians are going to do a lot of back and forth, I think. The last point that I wanted to share with you are some reflections that I've been doing around systemic racism and how it's perceived. And my thinking around this emerged quite early in the pandemic, when there were discussions of anti-Asian sentiments in Canada and the United States, where Chinese communities in particular were targeted because of the association with the virus in China. And this, of course, had all kinds of repercussions for communities in Canada and the United States and elsewhere in the world, some of whom have been here for generations. And so this association with China and the virus erased decades of citizenship and lived experience in our communities. So I was certainly thinking about systemic racism early on in the pandemic. And I think that might have been the way that I was thinking about some of the news headlines I was reading. And I'll just share with you, there was a story that came out of Toronto It would have been in the early summer. And the headline was something about, new immigrants and refugees being more vulnerable to COVID, or having higher testing rates. And I saw that headline and I immediately felt concerned that this would trigger more anti-immigrant or more anti-refugee sentiment. When I read on and looked at the article in full, what it in fact revealed was there was vulnerability because of housing situations, economic circumstances, and also because many of the people providing care in long-term care facilities were in fact newly arrived immigrants or refugees. And so there were structural reasons for the evidence, for the study and the findings that came out in the summer. And I was really struck in that moment about how easily we lose sight of these structural dimensions if we only pay attention to the headlines or to the news stories in a really superficial way. And as I was reading that article, I was thinking back to some of the associations that people had of early Chinatowns, for instance, in Victoria and Vancouver in the late 19th century. So we had Chinese sojourners and workers coming both for the construction of the railway, which is sort of fairly well-known history, but also in pursuit of fortunes in the gold rush. And these Chinese migrants were part of a transnational phenomena where they were moving all over the world in search of economic well-being. And the perception in Canada and the United States, because the early Chinatowns were quite crowded, they were largely men. The municipal zoning laws meant that there wasn't always the infrastructure to support, healthy, clean communities. And there was considerable racism, of course, which led to the segregated housing. So if you looked at these communities from the outside, what you saw was sort of crowded, decaying, bachelor societies, to use the language of the day, when in fact these were incredibly dynamic communities with benevolent associations, community associations, with men who were supporting families in China, were sending remittances home. And so what you saw on the outside was far different from what was actually happening in terms of the familial and community connections that were being maintained between Canada and the United States, and their clans and their villages at home. And I was reminded of the kind of structural racism that these 19th century migrants confronted, and the difference in perception and lived reality of their lives. And I was thinking about that in our current moment as well, thinking about how easily we lose sight of these multifaceted human experiences when we only look at the headlines, when we see sort of superficial explanations of statistics and of statistics and of how people are living their lives. And so I do think that thinking about headlines like the one that appeared earlier this summer, stories of how new immigrants and refugees and other communities that are seen as vulnerable are experiencing and living the pandemic, these are stories that need to be understood in all their complexities. And I'm sure my fellow panelists will also be speaking to these issues, because we are living an extraordinary time in terms of the pandemic, but in some ways it's not exceptional, because how we are experiencing the pandemic is very much rooted in how we were living our lives previously, the kinds of work that we were doing, whether we were depending on our ages, our communities. And so when we think about these exceptional times and these extraordinary times, I think it's also really important to look at historical continuities, and to be mindful of these issues as we wrestle with the challenges that in our current moment. The last thing I want to say, it's not one of my 3 points, but of course, thinking back and reflecting on how historians might be looking at the past differently, or asking different questions of the present, given the circumstances in which we are living. I think that there's some really important challenges for historians moving forward. In some ways, we benefit from being able to play with time. We don't have to do historical research right now to address the pandemic, but we do need to make sure that there are resources and records available to future historians and communities and individuals who will want to understand and make sense of this moment in the future. And so the challenge of archiving the current moment is considerable. And there have been multiple initiatives with, from the Smithsonian to local community archives. But there's an unevenness there in terms of the resources available to collect, to preserve, and to disseminate. And I think that one of the things that I'm thinking of as a historical researcher is just what the future archival record is going to look like. And so I think that is something else we might want to consider as we reflect on, witnessing history in this extraordinary time.